My name is Jenna Birch, and I am the Director of Alumni Relations at Westchester University. Thank you for joining us for the WCU 150 History and Heritage Exhibition Lecture and Tour Series. Before we begin, I would like to let everyone know that our next lecture and tour will focus on the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion at WCU with guest host Larry Dowdy. Please save the date for next Tuesday, January 18th at 7 p.m. and register online at wcualumni.org. You can also find the complete list of upcoming lectures on the Alumni Association website and recordings of previous events. Please remain on mute until the end of this presentation, at which time you will be invited to provide feedback and questions related to the subject. For the best experience, we recommend having your viewing screen set to speaker, which will allow you to view the presentation in the largest format. This can be found on the top right-hand corner of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Museum Director Michael D. Giovine and our guest speaker, Associate Professor of History, Anne Krulikowski.
Hello, and welcome to our next installment of the WCU 150 History and Heritage Thematic Tour and Lecture Series. I'm Michael D. Giovine. I'm an Associate Professor of Anthropology here at Westchester University and Director of our Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, which is located in the very historic old library building, one of the oldest buildings still existing on campus. I'm here right now in the WCU 150 History and Heritage room, which is an exhibition inside the Francis Harvey Green Library, so the new library next door. It's a very accessible place, and for all of you who haven't visited this already, please take the time in the next couple months to come in person to visit it. And you can also take a look at our 3D interactive exhibition that Jenna, I'm sure, will throw up the link to as well, so that you can kind of prepare a little bit. You can look at all these artifacts and photographs and hear the curators talk about them. I just wanted to say a couple words about this exhibition before giving you a quick tour and then throwing it over to Anne, to Dr. Krulikowski. I'm a director of the Museum Studies program, which is a minor program for undergraduates, as well as some graduate students also take these classes. And the WCU 150 exhibition was last year's cohort's capstone course. Every year, they take a number of classes throughout their time here at Westchester, and then every year they put on an exhibition in a course called Museum Exhibition Design. And in that, since January, 15 students have planned, they've discussed, they've researched, they've fabricated all these, we've built a lot of these cases and everything, and then installed it over the summer. So it took about 6-7 months actually 9 months to put everything together in time for the opening in September. And so these student co-curators are really the ones responsible for this excellent exhibition. And in the exhibition, in planning this, one of the things that we do is we talk about what is the big idea? What is it that we want people, visitors, to come away from? And, there were two competing ideas here. One of them, first of all, in terms of the design, was that we wanted to make sure that we had a systematic timeline. So what you see along the walls here is a timeline that goes through the entire 150 years of our institution. But we also wanted to tell a story. The students were very adamant about telling a story about our transformations from a normal school, that taught, high school age students how to be elementary school teachers, through the state teachers college era, where we then were a 4-year state teachers college, into a Westchester State College, a liberal arts college, and then of course the comprehensive public university, part of the PASHE system that we are today. But we wanted to see these transformations in light of 3 different areas: research and academics, which is one, and actually I'm here straddling those cases that kind of do deep dives into that. Student life and student culture, and we see a lot of different exhibit cases are about the arts, about clubs, about fraternities and sororities and Greek life, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have cases, and we're going to have speakers actually coming up in the next 2 months talking about gender, talking about sexuality, talking about ethnicity, talking about race and inclusion. And so we tried to kind of give that very nice overview of all of these aspects. So what we want to do today, though, in these thematic tours is take one particular topic. And of course, the topic for today is architecture, the buildings at Westchester University. Bring in an expert, and we can't think of a better expert than Anne Krulikowski. She was integral in being an advisor to our students as they were planning this. She's a public historian, and she's going to give a nice presentation about the architecture at Westchester. But I want to give Aaron Stoyak, one of our student co-curators, the opportunity just to kind of take you through and show some of the architectural elements and design elements that we have on display here to kind of bring to life the photographs and the stories that Anne is going to then share with you. So I'll throw it over to you, Aaron, and let me let me flip the screen. There you go. Sorry, we're at a skeleton crew here.
Yeah, so I am a senior history major, museum studies minor. I've been with the exhibit since January, and I'm just going to take you all on a little tour throughout Westchester's 150 years, some of the most important buildings that went up and why they're important to campus life as a whole. So starting out with Old Main. Most of you probably heard of it. It was a huge structure. It was the largest serpentine structure in the world at the time of its creation. The cornerstone was laid on September 14th, 1870, on the old fields of a Civil War camp for the Union, Camp Anthony Wayne. Here we have some Civil War artifacts, and as sort of a precursor, unofficially, to our normal school was the Westchester Academy, a private high school for young boys from the region. Now, as I'm sure you know, there's quite a few things on campus and in the Westchester area that are named after Revolutionary War General Anthony Wayne. We'll get to those later. But when the cornerstone was put in, they had a box of relics from the time they were placed inside. Mostly newspapers, that's a common theme, but also a history of the Westchester Academy written by a local historian. Now, when Old Main was torn down in 1972, a construction worker took off with the cornerstone thinking it would have money in it. The next day he brought it back, realizing it was only old papers, and a bunch of lost history was found.
Now I have to say, do you remember the story here? Because one of the things that we like about this, I forgot to say, is the last thing here is that we have an interactive time capsule. So you can come when you visit and you can deposit memorabilia from your time here at Westchester, or things just that speak to the craziness of this particular era that we're living in right now, so that we can use it as a time capsule for the future. And we've had several people actually deposit pieces of Old Main that they took in the 70s when they were demolishing it. And this was the biggest piece and my favorite. He delivered this. His family owned or knew a friend. I think it was a family member had a gravestone engraving company, and so they took this stone and engraved Old Main on it as well. So yes, and Old Main, I believe, was just demolished in 1971, right?
Yes, so as the school expanded, more students, you need more space, more things to do. And who was integral to that was our fourth principal, George Morris Phillips. His office was in Old Main, and you see many pictures of him. This is his original desk, courtesy of Special Collections. He also brought in Caribbean students. He did recruiting himself. A lot of testimony from the day that he created a campus hospitable to students of all races. He brought in guest speakers such as Frederick Douglass as well. This is a prized possession of ours, an original copy of Frederick Douglass's book signed by himself. Douglass gave his last lecture here on February 1st, 1895, before his death. So back to the buildings, 1886, we put together a dining hall and a chapel. Those are pretty much the two most important things to students of the day. But then in 1890, they started adding other programs, such as a program to teach gym teachers, which morphed into the College of Health Sciences we know today. There you see a uniform, and really that was put together under the direction of Clyde and Ella Ehringer. They were hired as the joint directors of this program, and they built our first gym, which is not the gym that's named after them today. That was put up in 1931. But this gym had a bowling alley. It was the first gym in the US with an indoor track. In 1892, I'm sure many of you recognize Recitation Hall. That is currently the oldest building on campus, still standing. And we also put together an infirmary. Pandemics are nothing new to the campus. We've had about a dozen closures before. Basically from 1870 to the 1920s, things like scarlet fever, typhoid, not the Spanish flu. But the infirmary was used to treat patients throughout. Now, to teach people to teach, you need student teaching. And what better way to teach your students how to teach than to bring the schools to them? That is why Ruby Jones Hall was built. Of course, it was not called Ruby Jones Hall at the time. It was called either the Model School or the Demonstration School, interchangeable more or less. In 1974, our first, it was named after our first faculty member of color, Ruby Jones.
That's her class register right there. Right?
As she was a teacher in the demonstration school who became a full professor. So that was a great way to honor her. In 1902, Old Library was built. And the cornerstone in there was laid by a Native American girl, Dabney George, who many regard as the most popular girl in the school. It included pennies from the day, yearbooks, photographs of all the seniors, and this started the tradition of students putting together the time capsule for these buildings. It would be graduating seniors forming a little committee and deciding, hey, what do we want to put together to commemorate this? In 1911, Wayne Hall was built, but not the Wayne Hall that you're thinking of. This was an all-male dorm on Church Street. The one that is currently up, used as faculty offices, was built about 60 years later, 1970. And of course, our iconic building.
We're gonna be kicked out.
Our iconic building, Phillips Memorial Hall. The logo or the object of many of our logos. Upon Phillips's death, it was put together. Money was raised and it was completed just before graduation. And at that ceremony, which was attended by many state supervisors, they announced that we would transition from a normal school to a state teachers college. That brought along with it a variety of degrees, no longer just a teaching certificate. Was offered in 1935. Our yearbook won an award from the National Scholastic Press Association for artwork of many of the buildings on campus, that just being one of them. Throughout its pages are hand-drawn images of some of the architecture. Yes, so in 1945, our women's dorms were integrated to impart to the work from a class of 1919 alumni, John H. Broadhead. But unfortunately, African-American men were barred from campus for decades to come. When we transitioned to the Westchester State College, many more buildings were put up. An explosion of students, programs, of course, transpired. In 1960, the Lawrence Center went up. 1966, the Francis Harvey Green Library, in which we are standing, was put in, as well as a whole host of other buildings, as well as a computer center in Anderson Hall. So if you can imagine the computers of the day, those were huge.
It's not this one.
Not quite, but what we do have is this, which would have been from the same time period. They used huge IBM systems, about room sized, but this is a Donner 3500 There are only 5 of them in the world, and you would manually do calculations by moving those wires to different variables. So in 1970, Sturzenbecker, the first building on South Campus, was put up. A lot of development on that campus, such as dorms followed, as well as the Gordon Natural Area was established thanks to the work of several students. We had Psych Student Union in 1976. That's what it used to look like, little disco ball. I wish it still looked like that.
Anne will show a picture, a better picture.
In 1981, the Quadrangle Historic District was established. This added the quad and 5 of the buildings on it to the National Register of Historic Places, this being Recitation Hall, Anderson, Old Library, Old Main.
I'm sure Anne will tell you.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Krulikowski would know for sure. Moving on, in Main Hall, before it was demolished, there was a club called the Main Hall Fire Brigade. And they would put together fire drills for fun and for practice. As you can see, those were the fire extinguishers at the time, because back in the day, the fire department was much farther away. Moving on here, many of these artifacts are from the Erringer Gym. These show our sports program, many Olympians, Paralympians that went to Westchester. In 2013, thanks to the work of many different parties, outside of Phillips Memorial Hall, we put together a statue of Frederick Douglass. And then our story music program first occupied what is now 25 University Avenue in 1960. But in around 2007, it switched to now the new Swope Hall. It was called Swope Hall before, but they changed it over. And our newest major addition was the newly named E.O. Bull Center for many of the performing arts programs.
Right, and all of these are pretty much products of alumni and students as well, like this costume and everything. Yeah, well, that's great. Thanks so much, Aaron. I think, we want to toss it over to Anne, and I'm sure you can give us a little bit more in depth about the different architectural styles. I love, the first thing I have to say, the first thing that came that hit me when I visited campus when I was applying for a job here was the serpentine structures and just the architecture in general. I really found it a really awesome kind of place to live, a place to work, and so I'm really excited and to pass it over to you and to hear more about it.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Aaron. That was a great job and a great lead-in to what I have to say. So, and I'll be referring to some of the things you brought up. So let me share my screen so I can show you some pictures. Okay. So I am going to, I know you all know Westchester has other campuses and even South Campus, which they've had for a while, but I really am going to focus on the North Campus with one exception. And of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the evolution of the campus. You've lived in the buildings, you've taken classes there. So I can't mention everything. I'm picking out some of my favorites and some that really showcase change over time. So hopefully at the end of my talk and my selection, maybe we'll hear from some of you what your favorite buildings are, or if you have special memories of certain places on the campus, which would be interesting to hear. And I think we have a really interesting contrast up at the top from the very beginning of the school to the postmodern university campus here. So let me see. So So why talk about the buildings? And I think Aaron gave you a good idea that we can really track a lot of the changes of the school and the evolution of the program and the experiences here through the buildings. And certainly the school, as all institutions do, celebrate new buildings and plan for new buildings and announce them. They have groundbreaking ceremonies. We still have the shovel from the groundbreaking of Anderson when all kinds of state officials came. We have cornerstone layings, dedications, time capsules. So all kinds of ceremonies, because creating buildings usually marks new chapters and new evolutions. And certainly what schools hope will be new opportunities for students and faculty at institutions. And maybe the demolition of buildings, as you see here, doesn't generate that kind of ceremony, but certainly generates controversy, public controversy, which is kind of a democratic ceremony in its own right. So let's go back to the beginning and look at the starting point of Old Main, which still, even though it no longer exists, as Aaron started with it, it still kind of hovers over the history of the school. So the Pennsylvania Normal School Act, which was written in 1857, established, you might know, not just normal schools, but a system of private normal schools. Pennsylvania didn't want to be committed to funding normal schools. This wasn't about access to education. They simply needed elementary school teachers for the expanding number of schools. And so they left it up to trustees to develop the curriculum. There's almost nothing in the act about the curriculum. The only reason they were state normal schools was because students could take a state test and get state credentials, which weren't even necessary to teach at the time, but people were planning would allow for more opportunity. Most of the specifications in the Normal School Act concerned the campus, the property, the physical facilities, because this is what this was going to be the big expense. This was the big risk. So the Normal School Act mandated that schools to gain certification so that students could actually take the test when they finished their classwork. There had to be at least 10 acres to allow for future expansion. The schools had to begin with at least a capacity for 300 students, which was going to be more than they needed, but again, to allow for some expansion in the near future. And you can see the original building was going to encompass everything, every activity or service a school provided at the time for the students and the faculty and the administrative staff, which was skeletal. Including space for that important model school that Aaron mentioned. When there weren't many elementary schools around, and there weren't many in 1870, Pennsylvania lagged behind many other northern states. And certainly before the automobile, it was not possible for student teachers to get out to public schools. So the model school, as Aaron already mentioned, had to be on campus and accessible to the students. The normal school students. And then there had to be an auditorium combination chapel that seated 1,000 individuals, which might seem a little bit excessive and certainly optimistic, but state legislators seem to have had the anticipation that normal schools would also become cultural centers in their district. And the state of Pennsylvania was originally divided into 12 districts for normal schools. And there had to be grounds for outdoor exercise, which was kind of forward thinking. So the first thing is the property, right? So the trustees had to raise money and sell stock. They sold off the Westchester Academy, that many of them had been trustees before, and they used the proceeds to be seed money. To purchase a property and build a building. And then they presented it to local residents and said, would you like to chip in and buy stock? The stock in normal schools was non-dividend paying, but stockholders got to vote and influence events and the school affairs. So they had to raise money and they had to purchase a property to begin with. So local residents offered them properties. Many of the trustees thought they should purchase a property outside of the borough to ensure good possibility for future expansion. But as always, politics will play an issue. And the district attorney wanted to leave Westchester. He had his eye on national political office. And he had a property down here where the Norm School was built that he actually wanted to unload. And he called in favors with his friends on the Board of Trustees and got them to vote that they would buy his property, that would be the choice, even though it was in the borough, even though it actually wasn't 10 acres, and even though it was an exorbitant price, far more than any other property was offered for. So they purchased Wayne McVeigh's property, dickered with Monahan and Ashburner, the two property owners to the north, to gain the full 10 acres, and then they drove the road through it so that their property would be separated from the neighbors. So this is an 1883 map showing the Normal School after it's built, but this is that first block where the historic quad is now. And you'll notice, just looking ahead, the county fairgrounds is across the street from Church, across Church Street. The county fairgrounds operated as Camp Wayne, a training ground for Civil War soldiers during the Civil War. And eventually the Normal School is going to purchase that property as well and expand over there. So now they've acquired a property and they have the money to build a building. So they have to think about what it's going to look like and who is going to build it and what it's going to be made of. It just so happened that a group of professional men in Westchester were having Philadelphia architect, who was an up-and-coming architect, design 4 houses for them on the north side of the borough on Virginia Avenue. And he was designing using serpentine stone, which was known throughout the area. Farmers had quarried it since the 18th century. But in 1869, a local resident named Joseph Brinton acquired the rights to operate it commercially. And Addison Hutton found out about the stone, actually because his brother-in-law was briefly Brinton's partner, which is how he knew about it. And to help his brother-in-law, he used the stone for these 4 houses. And as it would happen, 2 of these houses were for trustees. So that's how the trustees came to be acquainted with the serpentine stone and the work of Addison Hutton, which they really liked. And they particularly liked these mansard roofs, which are on the 2 houses that you see on the left. The mansard roof had been around for centuries, but in the 19th century, it became newly popular in France during the reign of Napoleon III, his second empire. Napoleon III created a plan where he demolished a lot of the medieval city and modernized it. And so even though the mansard roof had been around for centuries, Americans in the mid-19th century saw it as a modern style, not Victorian and not old. And the trustees in their notes, their meeting minutes, really indicated a desire to have something new and modern that would really symbolize the newness of the institution they were creating. And so they decided to hire Addison Hutton. They wanted the green stone. They were delighted that Joseph Brinton was willing to take some of his payment in school stock because he knew the building would be a great advertisement for him. And they went with the Second Empire style. Everybody was going with the Second Empire style in the 1870s. Philadelphia City Hall was started in 1871, a little bit more ornate than Main Hall will be, but Second Empire, for the movers and the shakers, this was the style to choose. So this was Main Hall. Addison Hutton followed the trustees' plan. This was a big undertaking. This building cost almost $120,000 in 1871 to build and to furnish, to outfit. And so what they did very practically was they asked the architect to design a building that could be symmetrical and attractive, but be added to over time, which allowed them to spread the cost over time as the school grew. Because remember, this is a private institution. Tuition has to fund it. The state periodically will kick in when they feel like it, but tuition has to fund everything. And actually, although Westchester was, I think I'm remembering correctly, the 5th normal school in the state. It actually turned out to be the first normal school. The state actually did kick in $15,000 towards the original building. So Westchester was the first one to get state funding for that particular purpose. But they started with the central and the 2 sides, and then they added the north wing, and then they added the south wing over the 1870s and the 1880s, which allowed them to move at first boys and girls. And I call them that because a lot of them were very young. A lot just came from 8th grade. They were as young as 14 years old. Some of the students have been teaching for years and came back when they could to go to school and were in their 20s and even in their 30s. So you had men and women who were in their 20s and 30s and boys and girls who were 14 and 15. So rules tended to be very strict because they were all housed in the same building, but building the wings allowed them to separate boys from girls very clearly, or very carefully. So the building served as dorm rooms, kitchens, laundry, classrooms, the model school. They had to have a room for a library, every purpose. And the school expands and expands and expands. After the wings are added, a rear central wing is added in brick, and that's expanded and expanded again. And something you can't see in this 1971 photo just before demolition is there was an annex added towards, that would be on the left-hand side, towards Rosedale. So this building just became a sprawling, monstrous building, which I see several of you, and I'm sure many of you remember it. And I see some people here even lived in it. And I actually should have my collection of serpentine stones. I have a bunch here, and I have some big rocks in my office. So this building served as the campus for 20 years. It's not until 1890 that the school under the Phillips administration begins its first big building campaign. But Main Hall remains the centerpiece of the school until 1971, when it disappears from the landscape. So, where's my gym? The gymnasium, as Aaron mentioned, is the second building that is added. The trustees were a little unusual in that from the second year of the school, they had mandated physical exercise for all of the students, which is pretty forward thinking in the Victorian period, because of course, many people thought that it would destroy women's reproductive systems, intellectual work, physical labor, things like that. But the trustees mandated calisthenics and outdoor exercise. And the gym signified that a lot of students had an interest in sports. It spurs on athletics, sports clubs, and eventually the sports teams. But a very important reason that we can all appreciate now, newly appreciate, that the trustees were so worried or concerned with fitness and the robust healthiness of the students, was that they were training future teachers who were going to go out to public school classrooms and be exposed to every disease that came around every summer. This was an era of recurrent epidemics. And even the school records of the principals like Phillips make marks about which students are healthy, who will be robust, who can handle teenage boys, who needs little children, who won't have the energy. They're very conscious that teaching is physically demanding and even risky. And along those lines, another building constructed at this time was the infirmary, which doesn't really seem strange, I'm sure, to anybody that a school, we still have a clinic today, right? Students get sick, everybody gets the cold and the flu and other things. But what is unique is that they actually purchased a separate property. They had plenty of room on the property they owned, but they purchased a new one away from the main campus to build the infirmary, because its primary purpose was to serve as isolation for those who caught or were suspected of having contagious diseases. So this was a 5-acre parcel that is where the Learning Research Center, the L.C. Bull Center, is now. And actually, eventually they'll purchase the farm adjacent, and you can see the house that we now know as Tanglewood. Eventually they'll purchase that farm. So the infirmary, since it was away from the campus, that was also built out of brick. and a little boiler plant was built out of brick. But actually until World War I, every main campus building was green serpentine stone. And in one of these was the principal's house. Many of the single faculty actually lived in main dorm, as did President Principal Phillips and his family. In fact, his children never knew any other house until they moved to Green Gables. By this time, a local architect, T. Rooney Williamson, was working for the school. He designed this in a couple of buildings. He was very important in Westchester. He designed the public library on Church Street, the firehouse on Church Street that was recently converted into a restaurant. And around the time he's working on Green Gables, it has kind of Venetian or Florentine windows here. He's also doing the courthouse annex that faces Market Street, which is in a kind of Renaissance Venetian style. This house cost $10,000. It was a little lavish. And later on in the early 20th century, the state is more regularly contributing to the normal schools, and many people in Pennsylvania resent that. And there's criticism about giving funding to the normal schools. And a couple of residents in Westchester's first district actually write letters to different papers. They write letters to the editors complaining, why can't the principal be happy to live in the dorm? They don't understand why the principal and his family need a house to live in. And they really don't think that a normal school should have a gym, that sports should not be emphasized. Normal schools are strictly to train teachers, give them that education, and that's all they should get. They shouldn't get state funding for these other things. So the gym in the principal's house turned out to really irritate the public for a period of time. And then, of course, another building that was built. And we see we're moving a little bit away from the heavy Victorian styles. This is kind of a very stripped down, clean style. Although when you look at it very closely, you can see it's got a lot of the traditional architectural details that the Victorians loved and appreciated, and that were typical of college and institutional campuses. Recitation hall was really important. This number of classrooms, despite the size, in addition to the size of main hall, shows that the school was growing in its student body. The big concern here was getting as many activities out of main hall as possible. They could never accommodate the number of female students, and normal schools were predominantly female institutions. Females more than males were willing to become poorly paid elementary school teachers. And that's what normal schools were for. And so they had to turn down students. They even had trouble finding accommodations in the borough. And so anything they could move out, the principal and his family, classrooms, laboratories, library space, they could turn into female dorm rooms. That's always a struggle for the school. And the students raved about the quadrangle. Once recitation was built, the central wing of main hall and the gym on the right side formed the first quadrangle the school had. And the students in their publications constantly expressed their delight in the space. They felt like it made the normal school a real college. They liked hanging out on the space, picnicking, and so on. So it is a space that has long been appreciated, although because of Wayne McVeigh's little deal in getting the school to purchase his property, they really were hemmed in. They tried to buy the property below Rosedale, but the state would not help the trustees and they couldn't afford it. So they lost that opportunity and really had a hard time. And the quad had to be turned into a parking lot, of course, for many decades. And then the expansion of the model school at the end of the decade shows that the school just was very promising. It was very successful, and they could accept more normal school students if they had more opportunities for them to practice teach. So the expansion of the practice school shows that the normal school was really thriving. The library was also added, and you can see, although it's serpentine stone, it was very much intended by the architect to be a classical revival building. And this used to be what you saw when you walked through the door. This great space with these scagliola marble columns. The Swope administration in the 30s ripped this all out in an effort to accommodate more books, but unfortunately we lost this very grand space. And then the final Serpentine building and the final building of the normal school era was Wayne Hall. It looks white here, but it was green Serpentine. It's where Smucker South is now, directly facing the old library. And again, it was decades until there were enough male students to fill up this dorm. The big importance of Wayne Hall is to move boys out of Maine so that they can be turned into female rooms, because there were so many young women who were seeking an education at that time. This is on Wayne Field. By this time, the school had purchased the agricultural field and built Wayne Hall. And here, unfortunately, there are lots of photos from this era, but they're all black and white. There wasn't color film. And so we don't really get that sense of the impact, the visual impact of the campus, all green. So we rely on these colored postcards for that, but it does give you a sense of that. So you can see the original property, the campus taking shape, and the expansion of the athletic fields and Wayne. I love a lot of the yearbooks. You can see the students really appreciated the beauty of the buildings, the green spaces. A trustee donated all of these rustic benches one year, and they constantly use their talents to draw the architectural features, the drawings, the edition of the Serpentine that Aaron showed you with the award-winning drawings. That's just beautiful. Those drawings are lovely. But throughout all of the Serpentines, the students really reflect their pleasure in the school. The school does purchase a farm, which becomes important in World War I. There's no rationing, but food is scarce, and the students actually grow some of their own produce for the dining room. Because the school has a hard time feeding the students. And a lot of public school teachers had to oversee, even in cities, 4-H clubs, community gardens. And so some agriculture and gardening classes were introduced into the curriculum. So the farm became kind of a practice classroom for the students. And pretty soon, of course, Tanglewood, that house would be remodeled to become the president's home. The last year of the normal school and the first year of the State Teachers College, we see a grand new building come to campus, which is a break with tradition in many ways. Phillips Memorial Hall was the first building to be named after a person, because technically the Wayne dorm commemorated the Wayne Civil War campground rather than directly Anthony Wayne. But the memorial building is named after a person. It's built to commemorate Phillips, the long-term principal. It's a new architect, a man named Price, and it's not built. It's the first building not built in Serpentine stone. It also introduces the Gothic style. It was considered particularly appropriate because the college was going to be a teacher's college. The normal school was gaining college status. Although they were still only going to train teachers, they were going to get a type of a bachelor's degree. So in all those ways, this is a break with tradition. You're all familiar with the architectural features here. Price told the Daily Local News that he got a lot of the ideas for the little embellishments from cathedrals he had seen on his travels in England. This archway particularly came from an archway he had seen at Winchester Cathedral in England. And of course, the beautiful sundial, which is still on the building. If you've ever, I couldn't capture it with my camera, I'm not a good enough photographer, but if you ever look at the stone is quite lovely. It's gray. A lot of it is shaded green though. So it's a nice tribute to the Serpentine stone buildings that already existed here. The State Teachers College, we see less building because there's a 10-year depression and a war. And even during the Korean War, there's a steel shortage. But we do see another Gothic building. They start adding junior high school education, which brings in a few more male students to the campus. And there's more students, female and male, taking fitness. And so we see the need for another gym. You hardly notice this today because the Hollinger Fieldhouse is on one side of it and then the annex is on the other. So this building is almost obscured, but it was a lovely building. And then at the right before World War I, we see the addition of the great recitation hall, Anderson, another great Gothic building. The history department had offices in here for a year, and I am telling you, we loved it. We'd say, don't you just love walking in here in the morning? It was just beautiful. There's something very satisfying about walking through archways. It just adds to the pleasure of the day of being on a college campus. So that was a remarkable building that was added. And I love this map that I found during this time in one of the yearbooks, because you can see what the campus represented to students. 12.5 acres of opportunity. This was their start in life, these buildings, this landscape. And then here's the annex. These were planned during the state college era, the state teachers college era. Swope brings long-term planning. He does seem to be quite a bit of an elitist. He had an idea of turning the campus into a model of an Oxbridge campus, college campus. He wanted to demolish all the Victorian buildings, all the green, and start building low-level dorms in a quad, so that the campus was fully enclosed and separated from the community. So the first couple of buildings take shape, and you can see we're moving far away. We're moving into the mid-century, but still building in stone. No details, no gargoyles or little embellishments. The windows function very nicely to add some visual interest here. And it's lovely to teach in. I've taught in some of these rooms and they get lots of daylight, which makes them very pleasant. This is a beautiful painting that's in special collections. The one building that's not on North Campus that I'm going to show you is just 10 years later on South Campus. This is just 10 years later, but it might have been a generation. This is very definitely mid-century modern. It's the low, long line. It fits nicely into the landscape, but a very different look, very different materials for it. Swope Hall, the music building, again, mid-century modern, very stripped down, no decoration, but very pleasant to look at, very attractive. The names of the buildings with the typeface became some nice decorations. So we enter the State College era with the two original buildings still anchoring, large main hall, and through the archway, you can still see the original gym. They're not going to last very much longer. After Swope's death, the Sykes administration expands and a little bit reconfigures his comprehensive plan. The State College is now going to offer liberal arts programs, and they forecast an enrollment tidal wave. So they still want to demolish Main Hall. That's a long-term plan, but they have to provide all kinds of dormitories and the dining hall so the building can be evacuated. And you can see that very much they tie the modern world, it's 1965, they're already thinking about the 21st century. They think that it's an era where nobody likes anything Victorian. In fact, in Philadelphia, the city planner, Ed Bacon, wanted to demolish the city hall that I showed you. There's just such a revulsion against everything Victorian. And unfortunately, on this campus, that's my own opinion, not necessarily the views of the sponsoring network, that side won out when it came to Main Hall. So we see some successful mid-century architecture. These three buildings, one of which has since been demolished, really draw on the tower in the park, the high-rise luxury housing, in some cases public housing that was used. This is Society Hill Towers. But these three buildings, I think this trio very effectively, they're sited on the north side of the campus, so they don't intrude because they're 8 or 9, 7 stories much higher, but they fall very pleasantly into the landscape. Originally, the dining hall was oriented towards the parking lot and towards College Avenue. It's been turned away. Of course, a lot of the mid-century buildings have been resurfaced and reoriented since then. And then, of course, there isn't a tidal wave. The faculty has tripled in size during the 1960s to develop upper level programs to start offering liberal arts degrees. You can see the faculty office here. You can also see the experience that the students recreate in the newspapers and the yearbooks, waiting in lines, the very crowded campus. Wayne Hall is another high rise. And you can see before the landscaping, the mid-century modern, the big expanses of wall. It's a starker type of building. But students get very used to the campus being one big construction site for almost 15 years during this period. And of course, I'm not going to go into this, what I call tragedy. The demolition of Old Main generates a lot of controversy. What comes out of it, of course, is an appreciation for the historic fabric. And Dick Webster, who was in the history department, writes a successful National Register nomination for that. And then we see this come to campus. As one trustee, Stanley Lieberman, who is a man after my own heart, I saw quoted in the school paper, this thing on the quad. And this is one style that the American public has never taken to. It was supposed to be rough, heavy massing, really make evident its technological systems, have no historical references or detail. So this is what characterizes some of the campus today. Brutalism came about in the 1950s. Actually, this was kind of old hat by the time Maine was built. It was used by a lot of architects who were reform-minded, who wanted to get away from elitist references to create a new style of architecture. Frequently, it was used for prisons. You can see why the windows were supposed to be very small. The other thing was, it was also associated with totalitarianism. And interestingly enough, one of the architects, Ehrlich, who worked on this at the beginning of his career in the 1930s, worked with a French architect, the one who liked to call himself Le Corbusier. They worked in Moscow for Stalin in the 1930s. So that was his background. And at the end of his career, the last building he designed was this, which we can still enjoy. And then, of course, Sykes is part of that. And the students didn't appreciate the new architecture. They have the historic plaques for all the old buildings they forecast are going to be knocked down. And Klutz Hall is the new building that is represented in the back. And then in the postmodern university, we have dorms. The postmodern era starts to bring back historic references. These, I would say, are, as I have here, ever so faintly Gothic. And you can see they even have the little window slits for bow and arrow. They also start green building. These were the first, two of these were the first to be heated by geothermal work. So they're part of a new era of trying to create a sustainable campus. And then part of the postmodern experiments in buildings that don't look like buildings, performing art buildings that look like pianos, but very effective, and again, sustainable and environmental with bamboo flooring, which added to that initiative. And then another Gothic coming back to campus. I saw on the facilities page, they say that this was designed to mesh with the prevailing Gothic, but normal schools and land-grant universities have never been predominantly Gothic. That is for elite institutions and private institutions. I think normal schools and land-grant universities have a more democratic path and have a tradition that way to respect. But Gothic seems to be creeping back onto campus. The drawing, as many architects' drawings, give that a little bit more firmly. I think in reality, the glass kind of undercuts, because of course, Gothic buildings don't really have glass. So this is kind of, Anderson, Phillips were neo-Gothic. So this must be neo-Gothic, another attempt to recreate. This building, of course, is almost finished. But I put it in just to remind us that the campus is always changing and always will be changing. And of course, many campus spaces are not buildings at all. The university also owns a number of green spaces and is dedicated to protecting the Gordon Natural Area. This is one of 4 gardens on the campus. So that is also part of the tradition of Westchester. And then some spaces come and go. This is the yellow kiosk that many of you will remember that more recently has been digitized, and I think also has an ATM machine in it now. But there are these kinds of spaces that are often part of students' lives and that they remember and have many memories connected to. So here is our magnificent quad. And I heard somebody from facilities say that this should be an oval because that's what Ivy League schools do. But again, normal schools and land grant institutions have a different path and tradition and democratic role to respect. And the quad still exists, even though there's an oval. The oval's nice, really nice. I went to the eclipse ceremony, probably some of you did. I've attended a band concert, so it does provide a very nice space. And we still do have a very clean campus, as you can see. So that is a lightning quick overview of the evolution of the campus.
Well, thanks. So we're going to be kicked out in a minute here because the library is closing. But are there any questions, especially ones that might relate to first to this particular exhibit before we leave the room? Or any questions for Anne as well? We're all tired. So while you're thinking of that, Aaron has, we wanted to thank Anne for all her hard, oh wait, I'm sorry, our thing is off. Hold on one second here. We wanted to thank Anne for all of her work helping us. And so even though you're virtual here, we wanted to give you your cover framed of your book. So Anne, do you want to say a thing about your book? I don't think we even pitched it.
Oh, I forgot all about it.
I did.
I don't know how I could. I can't wait to see it. It was a really interesting project, and I really appreciate the administration giving me the opportunity to work on it. I want to keep researching many aspects of the school's history, even the lives of early students. When the school was small, there's a lot of individual stories that are in the school publications, and it's amazing what a lot of the kids go on and do with their education all over the country and other continents. And there's just a lot more to learn about the history of the school and the role it's played for people. And I will say, looking quickly at the chat, I am so delighted that there are people out there who hate Main Hall as much as
You have to respect all architectural styles. That's going to be part of our heritage as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
I don't like it either, but
yeah, but there's a lot more information in the book. So hopefully we'll all see it soon. But thanks, it looks great. I'm so excited. Thank you.
Yeah. So the book is called what? What's the title?
We Serve, which I put out the map that actually was the school slogan for several decades. And it appears on a map that one of the art professors, Marion Farnham, drew this whimsical map of the campus and has.
Time is now 8 p.m. and the library is now closed.
Well, there is a hand up. We're going to run out, but Anne will be here and we'll still be outside.
Okay. So,
and the only question, this is Tanya Timms Taylor. The only question that I had to ask was this: wonderful presentation, bravo, bravo. The only question I have is this: out of all of the buildings that you know on Main, you have on campus, please tell us the one that actually won your heart, the one that got your attention, the one that captivated everything. You have to have one.
Well, it's probably old. You know what? It's Phillips. It's probably Phillips. A few years ago, I coordinated the, it's just Gothic. Everybody loves it. The students have always loved it, used the motifs in the yearbook. A few years ago, I coordinated Explore WCPU Day, when accepted high school students come and visit and take classes in their intended major. And as soon as I said I would do it, I even forgot I could use the telephone. I ran across to book Phillips Autograph Library. And you know what? After that, I contacted students to ask them what what helped them about the day when they visited, what was enjoyable to them. Every single one said they loved that room because we hosted our event there. So campus space, that's why universities pay so much attention to campus buildings and campus spaces. They're recruiting tools, and students are very responsive to campus spaces. So it's probably Phillips. As much as I treasure my main hall rocks and hate the idea of main hall being knocked down, it just sickens me, but it's gone. Phillips is beautiful. Thanks for asking. What's your favorite space? Anybody else have a favorite building from your time on campus? No? No favorite
And
building?
actually, Andrew Sargent asked a question. He
Oh.
said that he always heard that Main Hall's design was connected to the Kent State tragedy and the desire to erect buildings that were fortress-like in some misguided effort to make a safe building, or perhaps one could suppress student protests. Is any truth to that?
There could be. This was a style that was around long before, 15 years before Kent State, and was very popular with reform architects. There was a small group of architects and urban planners who loved this style. A lot of them committed to social reform. Brutalism was used for a lot of public housing. Unfortunately, a lot of public housing that was demolished because they became drug dens and stuff. So it would have been used anyway, because a lot of the architects who were at the forefront of their profession were getting these jobs. The other reason it was used was because it was cheap. It was really cheap. The original main hall, I'm writing an article about this. The original main hall was very expensive for its time. The stock, they paid a lot of money for it. That mansard roof is very difficult to lay. There are actually 2 roof lines, and you have to have skilled workers taking their time and know what they're doing. Concrete is really easy to pour and put up, and brutalist buildings were inexpensive to build, which is why the General Services Department authorized them for campuses all over. There was no way out of it, whether Kent State had happened or not. Buildings would have been poured concrete because they were incredibly expensive. I'm not saying the new main hall wasn't expensive, but compared to a Gothic building, it was less expensive and time consuming. But they certainly were fortress-like, which is why totalitarian regimes use them too.
But I had heard that too, though, that a lot of college campuses were building around that time to kind of exert the power, kind of this power over everybody.
But a lot of them, they started building them in the 1950s before all that campus uproar occurred. I mean, a lot of that doesn't occur till 1969. Even most of the 60s doesn't see it. So, and by that time, brutalism is actually on its way out.
Mhm.
We were retro. Pennsylvania was retro.
Was the reason that Anderson was built so close to Recitation? I had heard that Recitation was supposed to be knocked down after Anderson was built. Is that true?
They were thinking about it, yes. And it was, that's really interesting, because there was a long, slim site that Zanziger and Bori, who designed that building, who are great architects. They designed the chapel at Valley Forge. They did the Justice Building in Washington, D.C. They had a national practice. They really had to take a very narrow, long site to build that building. And there were plans that Recitation would eventually not be needed. But the war breaks out the year later. Recitation becomes an Army postal training center. And so it becomes a barracks, and then it becomes a girls' dorm. So they can never dispense with it. And then they do plan on knocking it down when they plan on knocking down all the greenstone buildings. But then there's that reversal and that move towards historic preservation. Yeah. So, but there wasn't a lot of planning in the original placement of Recitation Hall. They had that big open space, and they built it not close enough to church. They did position the original recitation hall, oddly, on the block, which created the problem.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Mhm. Thanks for the question. Any other questions or comments? Favorite? Yeah, somebody mentioned about the serpentine. A lot of architects caught it up. I mean, a lot of the greatest architects out in Chicago use it. John Root and who's the big architect in Chicago?
Remember, right?
Yeah, Burnham. They use it and they're convinced. I mean, if any place where you shouldn't use stone that is flammable, but people believed it wouldn't catch on fire, that it was very safe. But geology, I studying the Serpentine Quarry, and I really gotten into it. Geologist, there was the head geologist at the Smithsonian wrote a book about the use of stone. He said that and I'm quoting verbatim, architects are idiots. Was his point of view, is that they don't care what the properties of stone are. They just care about the color. And actually, John Root wrote a book about the color of stone. He said the Washington Monument was built upside down and inside out, that every building that they were building in the late 19th century was wrongly using stone. That's why buildings were collapsing. And so in that environment, serpentine stone was absolutely not the stone to use. And it turned out to be flammable. Yeah. Or inflammable. I'm getting confused now. Oh, Phillips. Somebody else likes Phillips. Michael. Yeah, I love Phillips too.
Do you know anything about the tunnels under from Old Main to Recitation?
I've just gotten an invitation to be shown through them. They were built, there was a powerhouse built on the athletic field in the late 19th century. And there was a system of underground tunnels built to connect the power lines to Recitation, to Main Hall, and to the old library. And they still exist. People still walk through them. So another thing was that block, Wayne McVeigh unloaded that property. He couldn't sell it to a farmer because that block flooded. And so the school actually on the ground, once Recitation and these other buildings were built, had to erect boardwalks all over because every time it rained, the whole block flooded. So Wayne McVeigh really pulled a fast one. He after he unloaded the property on the trustees, he went and he became Attorney General of the United States. He became ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. So he went on to better things.
One other question. The original gymnasium, I had heard that it was modeled after Yale's gymnasium. Is that true?
Yes, and they sent the architect T. Rooney Williams up to Yale, up to Harvard, who had both of them were building new gymnasiums. They really wanted to compete with the best. They wanted state of the art for that gym. And it supposedly had the largest indoor track when it was built. I haven't found a source to corroborate though. But yes, you're right. It was modeled on state of the art Ivy League, the best and the newest. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that a lot of people argued that could be used for a faculty club, for a student union building. I think it was. Does anybody remember? I've heard that it was being used for that by 1970. Thomas? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Tom, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay, I guess he. Can you unmute, Mr. Walsh? Oh.
Tom, you're muted.
Oh, maybe he can't hook up or something.
Can
Anybody?
Jen unmute him? There.
Yeah, okay,
Oh, okay, yes.
that's good. It was a recreation hall when I was there in '59.
Oh,
It
okay.
was
that
the-
early.
It was for day students.
Mhm.
And the lower level was the snack bar. It had like a long bar. And then over on the right, you went to the back and was the big day room, which was, I believe, the former swimming pool.
Mhm.
And there were tables, we could eat back there, and everybody was playing cards.
Oh.
They played everything from hearts to bridge, I guess. And I remember one day there was a big heart game, and Klaus Benkenstein nearly ran 3 decks of cards. He lost it on the last trick. And that was quite something to see when somebody took him out on the last card, running 3 decks. That's how big of a game it was that day in the rec center. And I forget whether they called that the Rams Head Inn, or was that, the Rams Head Inn or
Okay.
the Rec.
Okay.
Correct, yeah.
And Sandy remembers that too.
Mhm. Okay, interesting. Lots of memories connected with the buildings then. I see one comment. Somebody asked, is there any truth to the story that Ruby Jones Hall was part of the Underground Railroad? Ruby Jones Hall was built in 1899. So the Underground Railroad was long over by that time. So it wasn't part of the Underground Railroad. No truth to that story.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Anne? All right. Well, I would like to thank Anne and Michael for this great presentation tonight. And Michael, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say to the group.
No, I mean, that's it. Thanks for tuning in. Please do come when we're open. Check, you can check our museum, the website for the opening hours in the spring. Right now, we're in a transitional period, so we're not really open. But you can also write museum@wcupa.edu if you'd like to have a private tour. We can open it up. And we can work out something there as well. So thank you very much, and tune in next week for Larry Dowdy's talk. Aaron will be there again because that was his big focus, was diversity, equity, and inclusion. So hopefully we'll see some of you next week as well.
Okay. Somebody just asked about where can you get the book. They're still hoping that it will be available. Jenna, do you know by the end of the month maybe, or there's been a holdup with the paper, as there are lots of holdups right now, but hopefully it will be available in the bookstore.
Yeah, so the idea is that I was just in a meeting, so they were talking about it, and it should be in the bookstore. Again, you could also write museum@wcupa.edu, and we can work out where to get it as well. But the foundation, they're looking at all the options, and they are hoping to get it done by the end of this month or early next month.
Okay, great. And I'm glad a student, alumni from the class of 2015 says now she's heartbroken about Old Main. She never heard of it before. And that's one thing. I had 2 people read the book, and I really set it up and kept putting pictures of Old Main in the background of other things, because I wanted people to be really upset when I get to that event, and they both got upset. So goal achieves. So protect our heritage.
That's right.
Campuses have to change, no doubt about it. And Westchester's been really good at meeting the needs of its students, but can't lose all of its heritage, right? Okay, I see every head nodding. Great.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Everybody.